Hello again, book lovers. Our Human Herds, The Theory of Dual Morality by Stephen Martin Fritz is one of the biggest and heaviest books, speaking of the physical qualities, that I've ever read. It's almost 1,100 pages, proposing a new theory of morality, which is obviously based on evolutionary biology, I would say. So what's it all about? Well, imagine a circle, divide it down the middle vertically. On the left we've got the red side, which is called Mind 1, and on the right we've got the blue side, which is called Mind 2. Mind 2 being vertical, hierarchical, conservative, we would say today, and Mind 1 being more equitative and, we would say today, liberal. And they have existed in humanity as a herd animal since forever. If you go to the left of this circle, for example, you'll find a family type society where everybody's equal, the weakest are defended, etc. Whereas on the other side you get the more externally social side, where you get hierarchies and systems, laws, kings, emperors and the like. So that's what we're imagining, okay. The left corresponds to the left wing and the red, as in communist colour, and the right is the blue and the traditional, the conservative. And as time goes on, we shift, according to this theory, from Mind 2 to Mind 1. In fact, almost the whole of human history up to now, say within the last 100, 200, 300 years, has been the Mind 2 space. And a part of the argument of this book is that all these parts form part of the human herd experience. There will always be Mind 1 thinkers and Mind 2 thinkers, Mind 1 feelers and Mind 2 feelers. At the same time, you have a sort of dimmer switch which goes up to the top of the circle, where it represents abstract, scientific, raw data, and down to the bottom where we go into the realms of subjective feelings, inner lives and religions and the like. And again, it's hard to argue against that. There'll always be people who are technically minded, people who are spiritually minded, people who are more conservative and people who are more liberal. The argument of this book, if it has one central argument, is that they are all part of us and they're all necessary. So to accept this, we have to accept that what is right can change over time and due to circumstance. And what is the circumstance? It is material comfort. We are asked to supplant the old idea that democracy leads to equality and replace it with the idea that equality, especially material equality, creates democracy. And we find all kinds of examples throughout history of that happening. And all the way through this moral seesaw, we'll find some version of left against right, Protestant against Catholic, atheist against believer, and so on. Rather made me think a little bit of Nietzsche's division of society into two distinct classes. Also made me think of a video I once saw where cuddly little left-wing politician Owen Jones meets Rees-Mogg, who we referred to sometimes as Minister for the 18th century, and we saw a quite amusing clash of cultures there. One of the questions I remember that Mr. Jones asked Mr. Rees-Mogg, "When was the last time you cried?" To which Rees-Mogg replied, "As an adult?" suggesting that the idea hadn't even crossed his mind. So, there you go, that's the outline. There's a little bit more to it than that. I was quite convinced by it. We start with the outline, and that takes us 170 pages. Then we get the derivations, which are referred to as family, country, God, science and technology, referring to the north, south, east and west points on our circle. And for the rest of the book, extrapolations of the theory towards things such as politicians, philosophers, rehabilitation, punishment, education, history, democracy, etc., etc. All very interesting, I thought. It also reminded me of the bold attempts by previous philosophers to encapsulate the whole of human thought, such as Aristotle, for example, perhaps Descartes, you could say, starting from fundamentals, Francis Bacon, Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, for example. I once saw a drawing, I think by Gerald Scarfe, in a preface to Kant's Critique, and it was titled Kant's Philosophy, and it showed a cube, but it was kind of a cube made of, imagine an old buffet to sit on in the shape of a cube, with the stuffing coming out and patches on it and stitches coming undone. That's kind of the way we look at these, isn't it? It's a good attempt, not quite there, good attempt, and I will put this in the same basket. By force of the nature of the work, often huge philosophical schemata have to be reduced to pithy summaries, and I would have to say that's done quite well. The main criticism of this book, I imagine, will be that it's biased towards, well, take your side. I would imagine it would be seen as biased towards the right, and there are a lot of examples of where right-wing beliefs of not long ago seem like horrible Nazism seen through today's spectacles. But there's a lot of history gone into in this book. One of the points made is that keeping to the gold standard and laissez-faire capitalism were in fact left-wing ideas in the not too distant past. So that's the general overview, and that took me long enough. I'll try to just pick out a few thoughts that occurred to me as I was reading it over the 3 months that it took me. Guilt is described as an internal battle for the moral mind between the mind one and the mind two. That's quite an interesting concept. Again, reminded me of Nietzsche. The point is made that dictators rule by fear and reverence, something we forget sometimes. If you've ever met a Putin supporter, this will resonate with you. There are lots of examinations of philosophical nuggets. There's an interesting version of the trolley problem on page 726. And there's quite a lot, in general, on US politics, which I imagine is Mr. Fritz's speciality. We learn about the Civil War, some of the TV pundits, televangelists, some of the major writers, and the Constitution, which is analysed near the end, very interestingly, in my opinion, with the newly drafted Iraqi Constitution, which comes across as a web of fairy tales. So, I had a good time reading this, touched on a lot of topics that I am interested in. Education, I don't know if Mr. Fritz has been a teacher, but too much form filling, got some cheers from me. And he was also aware of the incidents at Evergreen University, which he references, and also Jonathan Haidt, whose writings on that incident I already reviewed in The Mollycoddling of the American Mind. Haidt is quoted along with Marx, Van Mises, Mencken, Goldman, Madison, Plato, Mill, Frankl. There's a lot to get your teeth into. Now, I'd just like to mention two linguistic points that our author makes in distinguishing between liberty and freedom. This is a little bit artificial, as they could be used either way, but the idea here is that freedom is the freedom that we have to do things, to choose, basically, to choose who we marry, to choose what breakfast cereal we eat, etc. Whereas liberty is something which is more granted by the law. You don't have liberty to just set up a company without registering, for example. You don't have liberty to pollute rivers. So that was an interesting distinction, as was the following: truth against fact. Fact goes at the top of the circle and is hard-nosed scientific and mathematical evidence, whereas truth goes at the bottom and belongs more to the subjective realm. God is love. That's true, isn't it? Well, it is for a lot of people, but we couldn't put it in the list of scientific facts. This distinction I found quite useful, and now, before I set out on a bike ride, I often think I'd like to change the truth of "it's a lovely day for a bike ride" into the fact of "I went for a bike ride." That's kind of how it works. And it's the changing of truths to facts that levers us over from one side of the moral sphere to the other. Not quite that simply, of course. Chapter 18 shows us the circle all out of proportion, with the northwest part looking more bloated, as that's where we live now on this particular moral compass. And then there's also the idea that you could zoom in. You could take almost any part of this circle, zoom in, and you would find, let's say you go to a right-wing religious sect. Even within there, you're going to find people who are more socially inclined and people who are more family inclined, etc. I suppose the deepest discussions in the book turn around these ideas, basically how you get at the truth and who you should listen to. It's interesting to think of English common law, where the idea is to protect the community. It could be seen nowadays as a kind of right-wing collectivism, which made me think of a Swedish film that I saw called The Square, which I would recommend to you, about an art gallery where they're all trying to be as trendy as possible, but there are scenes where people bringing the baby to work, somebody having an attack of Tourette's, are obviously inconveniencing everybody, but nobody dares to speak out and say anything. That's the world we live in. The attitudes we have today would have been seen as very peculiar 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and we imagine that in the future our attitudes will also be put under the magnifying glass and found wanting. One of my little thought experiments as a vegan is to imagine, for example, that imagine I'm right and it's a terrible, cruel thing to do to eat animals, and 50 years from now they've finally abolished it all, even in the places where they eat dogs, and nobody eats animals anymore. So now we analyse the current historical period. What's our conclusion? Everybody was evil, apart from the vegans? No, we don't do that. Well, some people do. I think they're wrong to do that. And obviously Mr. Martin thinks that as well, because our morality is shifting as we go along. He has a nice little tirade about diversity, which seems to be one of our modern gods. And in a throwaway remark on page 998 he says, "As of today," I quote, "there has been no push for polygamy and bestiality." To which my comment was, just wait. And can I also give some credit for saying, and I'm going to say it, nigger, instead of the rather horrible, quote, the N-word, quote, which kind of brings me on to the next point. Who's pushing for all these changes? One of his observations is it's the well-off, isn't it? It's the well-off that are in a position to push for change. Marx might have been poor, but he didn't have to work, and the Islington set certainly aren't poor. So this was a very wide-ranging and I thought engaging attempt to square a circle with a circle in this case. I didn't find too much to be objectionable to here. The hard swallow of this theory, of course, is to accept that slavery at one point was the right thing to do. Can we do that? We're not saying that it's the right thing to do now, of course, quite the opposite. But was it ever the right thing to do? Anyway, I had a good time reading this, had a little daily sessions. Don't know what I'm going to do now I've finished it. Let me finish off with a further couple of insights that I enjoyed. Alexis de Tocqueville, the commentator on America of a couple of centuries ago, is extensively quoted in the book, and one of his favourite quotes suggests that freedom and equality will always be at odds. Is that true? Will we ever solve these problems? Well, Mr. Fritz's attitude is probably they never will be resolved, and that's a good thing. It's part of the strength of the human herd that we have these divergent voices pushing and pulling. I mean, we don't want to live in a world where everybody supports the same football team, do we? Or you can't have any opinions outside what the government allows you. Apart from lots of odd little factlets that I gathered up along the way, here's my last point of interest. It's females who are more likely to accept changes than males. And this point is made with the example of the teenager arriving home one day with green hair and tattoos. Who's more likely to kick up a fuss, mum or dad? Yeah, you're right. Mum is probably going to say, oh well, it's a phase, etc., or whatever. And the interesting thing here is that although it is the females that attempt to introduce change, it's only when the males take up the change that the change is quickly transmitted through the troop. And I say troop because I'm thinking about macaques here. This is the example of the female macaques who learned how to wash their potatoes in the river instead of scraping the dirt off without any water. This clearly superior technique was introduced by one of the females and gradually expanded to her progeny, to whom she taught it. But it was only when the big old powerful males started to adopt the practice that everybody did, as if it was a fashion. That example comes from monkeys. A large part of the drive of this book is that we are kind of monkeys, and our morality is, and should be, that of the herd. I guess if you reject evolutionary biology, or if you're maybe too entrenched on one of the compass points of the circle, You're not going to like this theory. But at the end of the day, it reminded me of Jung's interpretation of the yin-yang symbol, that on the black side there's still a bit of white, and on the white side there's still a bit of black. Nothing's entirely black and white. One thing shades into another. We stumble blindly through history, clinging on to these pillars of knowledge or belief. We'll probably never get it sorted out, but hopefully, for most of us, we'll have a good time trying.